Welcome to Delta Talks Allyship 2.0. I'm thrilled to speak in particular to you about this conversation.
Does it count as allyship if you are feeling like you have a personal stake in the issue? There are multiple ways in which I kind of approach this from a racialized perspective, from a queer perspective, from someone who's gendered as a woman often. And I think that the pros of that means that I have multiple ways of insight, right? Ways of thinking and empathizing with various modes of how people are being in the world.
When I moved from Nigeria to the UK, I realized I was Black.
Wild. We're human. We are so complex.
Do any examples come to mind where you've inadvertently not noticed the gaps? Welcome to Delta Talks Allyship 2.0. I'm in conversation with Ilina Logani. Enjoy. On one hand, when we think about intersectionality, you were talking about, well, it's actually not about just layers upon layers, and that, like, what the image that comes to mind, it becomes more, it's thick and it's complex and intertwined and all of that. And your guidance is actually, yes, I'm not saying that's not important,
right.
But from a practical perspective, just wherever you are, notice the gaps. Who's not speaking? Who is not here?
Yes.
Who is being interrupted? Who doesn't have the space or the voice that I have?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Precisely.
like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Do any examples come to mind where you've inadvertently not noticed the gaps?
Oh.
Yeah.
Many.
Yeah.
I mean, the was like, yes, I feel like it's always a constant learning process, right? It goes back to what I mentioned in terms of having to take a step back and check myself in so many different ways. I would say probably the most pertinent, there was some hometown advocacy I was doing in 2020, which for those of us, all of us should remember, but 2020 being a particularly pertinent year for racial advocacy across the world, in particular in the United States, in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And there were so many moments, I would say, in kind of that hometown advocacy, specifically working towards racial justice in my schools in my hometown, which can be historically a site of racial violence. And I mean violence I would not use violence lightly. I think oftentimes in corporate spaces and academic spaces, when we use the word violence, we mean as a metaphor. I mean literal, right? So I think that there is something to be said about the fact that in a movement where you're really trying to push back and create spaces that are physically safer, emotionally safer, psychologically safer for the few students of color who exist there, you're gonna stumble into things. I think one of the things I stumbled into was a simple matter of, my voice had a lot of authority. I wrote an op-ed, meant that people put leadership onto my shoulders, meant that people were making eye contact with me when they were having conversations, and meant that people were directing their emails to me. For instance, when I had made it explicit that there were 4 or 5 different people who were, on this team, who were doing this work, who needed to be reached out to as well. I think I stumbled in the first few weeks because I didn't, I think, actively work as laterally as I should have. I think that there was a lot of confusion, and what happens in confusion is you recreate kind of hierarchies of power. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's also something to acknowledge in that it is so affirming when you are given the space, when attention is being turned to you. So particularly if you're someone who's, like me, who's, when we think about all of our other identities, find yourself underrepresented positions of power. So the question that's emerging in my mind is whether we think, this is an open question, do we think it is more challenging or easier to notice the gaps if you yourself have been, on the receiving end, or, have multiple marginalized identities? Is it easier for us to say, actually, no, you know what, I'm going to step back? Or is it more tempting to be like, finally,
I have
I
space.
have the resources.
Yes.
I have the ear of people in power. I have the ear of the boss or the CEO. They've made me the head of the ERG, the Employee Resource Group. This is great for my career. I mean, all of those things feel natural.
Yeah,
in terms of the
absolutely.
next
And
step.
they're so human. Like, I think that's such a normal response. And I love this question because I don't know if I have a clean answer. I think I'm leaning towards, despite all of that, the very act of noticing the gaps is easier, I would say. In my perspective, for someone like me who has operated in multiple gaps, I find it easier to look around the room and notice whose labor is being unrecognized in this space, and who's not just labor in terms of the work that they're doing, but the emotional labor, the presence that they're bringing to the space, the kind of mothering they're doing in the room. And I use mothering in a loose gender way, right? But I think that for me, it is something that almost feels preternatural because it is something that I'm so used to from such a young age. Acting on those gaps, I think, is maybe the second half of your question is a different bit. And I'm curious to hear what you think about that, because I almost find it easier, or I've almost, in my experience, I've noticed that there are people who, once they're accustomed to noticing the gaps, the more privilege they have, the easier it is for them to actually kind of shed the spotlight a little bit. I think that you're pointing to something very astute, which it is difficult to give up the space once you've been denied it, when you've been denied it for so long and you're given it. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm hopeful that I think I feel similar to you, and when I think about the people that I've worked with for whom, like the whatever communities they represent or whatever like aspirations they have, particularly within their organization, I think there's such a deep commitment to it that even like within their own sense of like progress and measuring progress and kind of getting to justice and equity where all forms of talent can thrive, I think that voice internally is loud enough. When I think about the different examples, when I think about examples where maybe I'm not as optimistic, what comes to mind is the context in which they find themselves in, right? So they maybe haven't had the opportunity to. They've had to play the game a lot more, right? They've had to be a lot more of political animals.
Yes.
And, you and I have spoken about the spheres between like the politics and the professional and the personal, and the choices, I think people have to make. And so I think what's come into my mind is it's probably not fair to just think of the individual and essentially say, actually, you have access to all of this. You need to make sure the onus is on you to notice the gaps. That is important, yes. I think I also need to bear in mind the organizational context in which in which different individuals who belong to historically marginalized communities, like, what context or what organizational context they find themselves in, and what types of support they have,
and how they've gotten
resources.
there. Yes. Makes sense.
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
One of the things we talked about was, almost like the opposite end of that spectrum, like being afraid to, like, not speaking up, like spotting, like having some awareness, so maybe noticing the gaps, potentially being in a position of privilege.
Sure.
And noticing those gaps and then not doing anything about it. I would just love your thought, because now we're speaking to many people who would consider themselves allies, as well as individuals who generally would self-identify as belonging to more privileged communities, right? So we have someone who belongs to a privileged group, or relatively more privileged set of identities, who notices and then doesn't do anything about it. Yeah.
Oh,
How
wow.
do we get them to
do something, or to feel comfortable, perhaps, in the space that they can impact they can have here. This is so complicated because I think the decision to choose not to do something has so many layers, right? There's the personal ostracization question of if I do something, am I going to lose my social capital, perhaps, in whatever space I'm in? Then there's the political layer. I operate more in this realm, I will say. I think that oftentimes grassroots organizing, the things that we contend with are, if we do something, who is going to be facing the biggest political backlash? From like not just a social level, but from an institutional level, who is most likely to be reprimanded or to face disciplinary action or to be, have their details shared publicly. These are all questions. I kind of want to take a step back because, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like you're kind of gearing towards that first, when perhaps the material, tangible consequences are not as severe, but the socio-political consequences in the space you're in feel
correct.
Yes.
However, I love that first point around actually just kind of starting from are other people going to have a worse outcome if they do this versus me?
Exactly.
And if this organization is important to me, if the thing that we're aiming for is, collectively, the thing that I have a role to, I see myself as a leader, I have a role to play in terms of getting this organization where it is. And I'm not going to lose out as much as this other person is.
Right.
I think that's an important first kind of like
first step,
wave of analysis.
Exactly.
Right?
And it is absolutely so linked to intersectionality because, I mean, you're saying it, but to be so explicit about it, those are going to be linked to the identities you hold in the space, right? In the political sphere, in the corporate sphere, in the educational sphere, right? Which I'm, the people who have the financial resources, the people who have the visual appearance that makes them maybe less of a threat, right, in an environment. So, I think you're right. An absolute good first wave of analysis is to say, if not me, who? And if there is someone else who would, but then face harsher consequences, I don't know. There's a question that I have in my mind of does that build courage in you? Do you have then the sense of, okay, if not me and nobody else, but we have a collective goal we're going towards. But I also want to approach this with a little bit of empathy on that front because it's so, it's so easy to say, oh, if not me, who? And, and yet the fear exists, absolutely. Right? And yet the question of, do I say something? How do I say something? Am I going to get it wrong? If I say something and it's the wrong thing, am I going to make it worse? These are all questions that are so natural. I think that the way that I think about allyship, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this, but it's a constant act of love. It's a constant, not to be sappy about it, but it is a constant act of choosing that level of compassion that I think kind of an ethic of care that I feel like is a central kind of North Star in how I think about this work. And in most things, that involve that level of kind of vulnerability that comes with compassion and love, you will make mistakes. It is inevitable. I've made so many mistakes. I'm sure that, looking at you across the table, I'm sure we both can think of many moments where we've misstepped. And I think the self-compassion part of this, of being, yes, I might say something and it might be wrong. I might say something and someone might be hurt, and trusting that you're able to respond to that in a way that is, compassionate both to yourself, but to the person who has been hurt, and say, oh, I'll learn and I'll do better next time. I don't know. Is this resonating?
Totally. You can see me nodding. I love that. I talk about vulnerability a lot with leaders. Talk about compassion, but not in the kind of really powerfully resonant ways that you've just shared. And so I just want to reiterate, there's self-compassion and compassion towards others. And that kind of the mix of those two will kind of help you think about, well, you know what, when I'm in that space of vulnerability, self-compassion and compassion, if I make a mistake, that's all kind of like, that's all part of the process.
Part of the process. It absolutely is. It's what it means to be an ally. No one's born a perfect ally. No one's born a perfect, and you can say this with words even without using the word allyship, but nobody is born a perfect companion to somebody else, right? And if we're thinking about allyship as companionship, as mutual support, I think that, it is a constant learning process.
I love that. So I've written an article recently on what I titled Allyship 2.0. And one of the things that I've said in that article is how at a time such as this, if never before in recent times, we absolutely need to really dig into what allyship means for us and stand up for justice, but also stand up for kind of just equal outcomes and fairness within organizations and in society more broadly. And I think kind of going back to what you're saying around some of the fundamentals of kind of seeing oneself as part of a community, part of others within my organization, thinking about oneself, yes, as a leader, but also someone who's kind of vulnerable and kind of connects to others. I think that just gives it reinforces some of the key messages and reiterates those messages. What I'd like for you to comment on now is how do we sustain that behavior? I think it's all of this is well and good, kind of just tune into, notice the gaps. Check the extent to which, you have a little bit more credit in the bank than others. And, if not you, then who? Stay in that space of knowing that you will probably fail and make mistakes, and that's okay. Compassion for yourself, compassion for others.
Right.
But as you've said a number of times in this call, we're human.
Yeah.
Right? And this is, in the hope that, you just kind of take those steps and right. So how do we sustain those steps? And I tell you what, I've been wondering whether we need metrics for allyship in organizations.
Fascinating.
What are your thoughts?
Oh, wow. Metrics. You want hard numbers.
Hard numbers. Because
I'm over here talking about feelings and emotions, and you're like, I want to measure this.
It's so important
it's fair.
now.
It's fair. Because it's also part of the gaps is questioning how are we actually knowing if we're noticing these correctly?
Absolutely.
If people who are in the gaps are unable to unable or for whatever reason are not being called in to actually express what their experience is. Wow, good question.
How do we continue to keep a level of confidence and trust that we can instill this type of culture and it is maintained within organizations?
I mean, this is so much your area of expertise than mine, Doyin, but I will say, in terms of metrics, the way that I generally find, if I feel internally, the way that I feel internally that my allyship, my advocacy is landing, is doing the work, is I'm constantly asking the people around me, what do you need? Do you need something more? What is happening? It's a constant listening ear, whatever that looks like in your space, whether it's a survey mechanism, whether it's a just informal conversation, in ways that kind of try to depower the space a little bit, right? To bring it on a peer level rather than like an authority and someone speaking from below level, to try to dismantle those and just truly, again, it does come back to just being human, but I would say just like a genuine like listening connection. Because for me, it's just been through informal chats, to be quite frank, at the end of the day, which I know is hard to have a metric on, but it is how do you, you can't expect the numbers to just, or the data to just fall into your lap on that front. It is a proactive way of proactive listening, maybe. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that because, like you said, there are already mechanisms within organizations to gather data, whether qualitative or quantitative.
Yeah.
But turning it, what I'm loving about what you're saying is kind of turning it to the other members of your organization, other kind of colleagues, and the impact that you're having on them, that is, kind of getting data on that in whatever format and whatever we call it, gives you an idea of the progress that you're making.
Yes.
And gives you opportunities to pivot if you need to or to adjust. I think that could work.
Could work,
actually,
right?
could work.
It's just a question of, I think sometimes we presume that the mechanisms we have in place work, but if they're being passively, operating, if they're passively operating, thank you. I think that there's a question of the people who are multiply marginalized. are you actually being measured in that, or are you kind of, that's a gap that you're escaping through? So that's the proactiveness. It's the kind of the act of reaching out to say, hey, what more? Before having people come to you and saying, I need more.
Absolutely. And I think I would also add some measures or some indicators of accountability.
Yeah.
I think there is like listening, taking it on board, and just, kind of holding oneself or a collective responsible for responding and showing that they've responded.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I feel like there's so many other places this conversation could go.
Gosh.
There is a lot in there that you've shared, and I genuinely appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you
Ilina.
so much.
Was there anything else that you were thinking that, might be helpful? So again, our listeners are generally within organizations. Many people I anticipate will be tuning in because they're thinking, actually, how do I put into practice allyship, and how do I bear it in mind what's going on in the world? What are some of the different or small ways in which I can just start from a practical perspective to live that identity of an ally or advocate, which I've heard you use.
Yes. That's the word I tend to use, advocate.
Yes. Actually, could I ask a little bit
Yeah,
about that?
please.
Tell me for you, what the similarity or difference is between ally and advocate.
Oh, wow. Put me on the spot here. Partially, I think I use the word advocate because ally feels, I think sometimes ally to me feels like a word that in common parlance has lost a little bit of meaning in my worlds. I think that people will use ally glibly without the work of allyship. Advocacy, in my mind, perhaps definitionally is the same thing, but it requires such a level of constant work that I think for me it just feels like the kind of word I want to use because I can never be a passive advocate, right? I think I have seen passive allies. So you know what I mean? So that is why I use
crystal
that
clear.
word.
I love that. Passive allyship. Boom. Oh gosh. So I want to just do a little segue into why I wrote this paper, because what you've just said speaks so powerfully to the underlying reason for me in terms of why I thought, I just need to write this. So in uncertain times such as this, definitely from a psychological perspective, right? You're kind of you're starting to question, who am I actually? I need to almost rather than reach out, I need to just narrow in, right? And kind of protect myself and just kind of focus on what I absolutely. And what I'm hearing you say is, when sometimes we overuse the expression allyship, and we need to think quite intentionally about being more mindful using, for example, the label advocacy, which then puts a lot more, that's more of a doing, right?
For me, yes.
In it, right? I can see it.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking in the lead up to the new administration and in the US and all of the changes in the world, I was thinking a few months ago that we needed to remind people that the work continues, right? And in these uncertain times, people are looking to their leaders to be that stabilizing force. This is still important. This is where we're going. I've been working with some clients recently, and they were talking about their leaders coming together and reiterating, these are our values. This is what matters. And as I'm thinking about those conversations, I want to introduce, what you've kind of really so powerfully reminded me of, about the being mindful and intentional in the work that you're doing. The intentionality. Right. We've done a series of programs with senior leaders, which we call the Ally Acceleration Program. And one of the things at the heart of it is a group of people, a group of leaders kind of just checking in with each other, sharing best practices or kind of what things that they've learned, things that they're still learning, they're stumbling over. And I'm just going to that message around kind of mindful intent is going to kind of continue to resonate. That's one of the many gifts you've given me in this conversation, Ilina. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much for giving it.
Enjoy the full conversation between Dr. Doyin Atewologun and Ilina Logani on our YouTube page.